Amensol's Shadow, The Fox and the Wolf, Part 3. So the fox went right along, his new friend out in front. He sniffed out prey until they spied an angry elephant. He did not see the little fox while huffing down the trail. Wolf saved fox from angry stomps, but one stomp got his tail. "Oh, thank you, Wolf," said the fox. "You really are too kind." "'Tis nothing," winced the injured fox while tending his behind. "Ah!" the old warrior yelled, bleeding out of a gaping wound in his stomach. The blade had pierced his liver. Even over the cries of the battle and blood, the noise turned several heads in the midst of all the chaos. Corinna had been off her horse for several minutes, assisting in pushing the lions farther from the gates of Amensols. If they could not stay the attack, there would be no place to bring the wounded. "Cleric, now!" Corinna yelled as loud as she could. There was no way her petite frame could drag the man's burly form out of combat. The cleric showed up and helped her drag him behind the walls of the city, just behind them. Instantly, more fighters surged forward to take her place. She stopped for a second to lock eyes with her first officer and waved a flurry of hand gestures to convey her tactical wishes for the cavalry while she was not on the field. She returned her attention to her friend and mentor dying at her feet. "Fix him!" she shouted at the cleric kneeling beside the old man. The cleric was mustering what focus he had left. His body felt drained of his magical energy, mana, from the raging battle. "I'm trying," the healer shouted back. Corinna knelt down beside the cleric at the side of the wounded. She stroked his face with her hand, usually so intimidating and strong, but now tired, his eyes struggling to focus on her. "Hugrith, stay focused on me. Look at me." Corinna's usual determined appearance was replaced with anxiety and sadness. Her voice cracked as she spoke to Hugrith. "Hey, I need you. You need to hang in there for me." Tears escaped her eyes as they looked over at the struggling cleric. "He's lost now. I don't have the strength. The wound is too deep. And he's lost so much blood already." He shook his head in defeat. Corinna already knew this wound was mortal, and righteous miracles did not happen in this world. Not to her. The cleric slid away from their side with apology and raced back to his position on the line, leaving Corinna alone to confront her tragedy. "Stay!" Hugrith managed to get out, searching for her face. His eyes were glazing over, his senses shutting down. "I'm here, Hugrith. I'm not going anywhere." She grabbed his large hand and placed it in hers, on top of his chest. "Stay with..." Hugrith's breathing was slowing, each breath harder to take than the last. Sharp pain shot across his face intermittently, as his nerves gasped for life. "Hugrith, I'm here," she whispered to his face. She could no longer hold in her emotions. The tears ran down the tip of her nose and fell onto Hugrith's dirty cheeks. "You've always been there for me when I needed you. When Hanai died, when my parents died, when I didn't know how I would raise my son by myself. I'm not leaving you. What will I do if you leave me?" Corinna laid her forehead on his, praying to anyone to spare her friend. Suddenly, Hugrith released his hand from hers and brought it to the collar of her armor. He pushed her back and stared into her eyes and gasped for breath. Hugrith lay dead within the gates of Amensols. Corinna's tears of sadness turned to tears of rage. In Hugrith's last breath, he upheld his duty to his friend and King Amensol. The same Amensol that had led them to battle against the hordes of the ravaging Lord and Asari, their former deity turned oppressor. The Amensol that had persuaded others against her advice to meet them on the field of battle instead of behind the safety and security of the Silent Sanctum, the retreat built in the side of the Rhone Mountains just for this purpose. The Amensols who sought prestige and the growth of his own fame over the lives of his people. Hugrith died for the king's hubris, and now it would kill them all. Corinna did not stop to dry her tears as she drew her sword and headed back to the front line at the outskirts of the front gate of the human city of Amensols. She cut her way through the skirmishes, avoiding the distractions of war, and arrived at the side of Captain of Ranks, Hugrith's next in command. "Lorne, Hugrith is dead," she said, steel-faced. Her anger was now overshadowing her remorse. Lorne looked at her, stunned. "I'm in charge of the army now. I'm setting horses to the gates. Burn the entrance and meet at the east gate with the King's Guard and the rest of our troops." Lorne stood still, noticeably shocked at her words. Lorne knew that the command of men fell to him, not to the command of the cavalry, but he was not about to argue with Corinna, the champion of Amensol. It wouldn't have mattered if he did. She had already turned away to her next task. "Aye, ma'am," Lorne finally said and turned to his second. "Retrieve the oil and get the men behind the gates. Hold fast at the entrance." Corinna moved with purpose. She raced back to her horse, who was stamping around at the entrance of the city, eager to get back into the battle. She mounted and stormed off toward her cavalry, who were busy separating the enemy into groups by fighting their way across the front lines, back and forth, giving the knights time to regroup between bouts. Many horses and her soldiers lay dead around her, but she was unmoved by the loss at this point, and finally caught sight of her captain. "Fall back inside the gates. We will join the army on the east side of the city. Have my men tie off to the pillars of the gates and pull it down when you are ready. We are in the emergency evacuation plan as of now." Corinna waited until she got confirmation that he understood her wishes, and she was off again back to the gate entrance. Her mind raced faster than her horse's legs, replaying all the foolish decisions the king had made that led to this horrendous loss of life. She was going to honor Hugriff's words and stay with Amensol. And this time, he would listen to her. He had no choice. The knights cleared a path for the cavalry to enter the gates just in time as they thundered in and dismounted as quickly as they could. The ropes were ready, supplied by the armed support who aided those fighting on the front lines. The main gate to the south of the city was supported by two large wooden beams as wide as the wall itself, about 4 cubits. The lintel beam across the top was also solid wood from one tree. They had been harvested and fashioned as a gift from the elves who had helped build the city years before. 20 ropes each were attached to the bar, hooks, rods, and anything that was fastened to the beams themselves. Then the ropes were tied off to the horse's armor. A horn sounded behind them as Corinna blew the call for retreat. Lorne yelled furiously at those fighting inside the gate to disengage and flee. His men took off at the same time as the cavalry. After a few seconds of constant pressure, the beams broke free of their position, twisted, and slipped just enough to cause a chain reaction, with the stone built around them. The outside edge gave first, and the stones from the top wall lost their grip and fell onto the revenant soldiers below. With the decreased weight and momentum, the horses continued to strain under the intense weight, and one side pulled free enough to unseat the lintel beam. It came crashing down, pushing the side beam even quicker, as tons of wood and stone crushed the army below them. As the last of the overhead structure crumbled down, the huge mass of wood and stone now blocking the entrance to the city was bathed in oil from the soldiers on top of the wall to the sides of the gate. The oil poured over the rubble and the enemy, wasting no time climbing over to continue their domination. Lorne took a torch from one of his men and threw it onto the pile, and it burst into flame. The fire licked up higher than the wall itself within seconds. The enemy that was climbing over was instantly engulfed, and those that made it over were finished off by the soldiers of men. Corinna stared into the flames as her own anger burned inside her. The gate here would be impenetrable for maybe 30 minutes, but then the hole would be an easy entrance into the city. Time was short to complete the evacuation. The wounded and the clerics were already making their way through the small but beautiful city to the east gate. No doubt the army outside the gate was doing the same. Corinna rejoined her cavalry and led them and the archers to the walls of the east gate. The east gate was smaller, but it was sturdy and the closest to the hall where Amensols and the leaders resided. It was harder to penetrate, but more crucial than the main gate to the destruction of the city. The bulk of the fighting had been toward the main gate, but the better fighters had been routed around to hopefully infiltrate closer to the king. It was the practice of the Revenant to target the leaders of whatever group they fought. That was why the leaders of each group of fighters were never figureheads or placed by prominence, but the best fighters among their peers. Hugriff and Corinna, one over 60 and one under 30, both led their respective armies because they were the best of the best, and their men followed them and their decisions without derision. So when Corinna arrived at the east gate and gave the orders to the King's Guard to prepare the evacuation, they immediately responded before getting word from their captain, the King's son, Avendir. Avendir was the best among them. He had been trained by the best fighter Havensong ever had, Hanai. But the King's Guard still fell underneath the commander of the infantry, Hugriff. Corinna's riders had all dismounted and were volleying over the wall to alleviate the fighting to prepare for the retreat northward toward the mountain tower. The king was still inside the hall, leading strategy from cover at the behest of the leaders. A death to the king would be a crippling blow for the race of men at this point, and Amensol, despite his wishes to join the army, respected the fact enough to stay there for the time being. He was looking for an updated map of the army's position when a scout crashed through the door. "My king, the south gate is burning. The cavalry and infantry have joined us at the east gate. Corinna has called for execution of the evacuation plan." The scout paused, waiting for orders from his king. The king stared at the table for what seemed like forever to those in the room, waiting for a reaction. It finally came. "No!" Amensols shouted as he cleared the tabletop with a quick stroke of his impressively large arms. "She has given up so easily?" he asked rhetorically to the advisors standing around him. "My king, the fighting at the east gate is continuing, but they will not be able to evacuate if the Revenant's other force surround the north side." The scout knew that his king preferred truth over a sweetened view of the situation. The king had been waiting for the fulfillment of the prophecy passed down to them during the summit on Vesu by the remnant of Ginto, protected by their goddess Ginavi from the scourge of evil that plagued their population and turned them into dark and violent creatures, renamed the Revenant. The remnant held to their conviction that the ravaging lord and his army would break beneath the sons of Terminus. That conviction had been passed to the sacred six races that bound their futures to each other and to that promise. The next 10 years spent building the three sanctums that would spare the inhabitants until the sons of Terminus would save them. There were some that believed that heroes from the races would emerge and tear down the alliance of evil the ravaging lord had built up. And Amensol was bound and determined to bring about the end of this war by meeting them head-on. The sons would reveal themselves in the midst of battle and lead them to victory. It was time that the tide of this war began to reverse. "Then now is the time for us to strike." King Amensols turned from the table and glanced around the room, memorializing this event in his heart, remembering the faces of his fellow men, those that would share in the new dawn. "Now, my brothers and sisters, is the time to loose the sons of Terminus." The king's hand felt its way to the pommel of his sword, Godfall, given to him by the Council of Elves, crafted with magic and imbued with powers to withstand the blow of any weapon ever created on the face of Terminus. 3 weapons were given to the leaders of the Archai, the men, and the Dark Myr, for waging war on the fallen god men leading the Dark Armies. Amensols slid Godfall from its sheath, its white hue emanating from the glimmering surface. His eyes were wild, anticipating the coming glory and the fulfillment of their destiny. His hand slowly raised above his head, gripping the sword tighter until his knuckles turned white. "To war! To victory! To our destiny!" shouted the King of Men, and he led his people out of the Hall of Havensong toward the battle at the East Gate. "Keep firing!" shouted Corinna to the archers taking cover on the top of the wall of the city. The archers knocked their arrows under cover from the poisoned darts of the Revenant soldiers shot from their positions, popping up only long enough to aim and loose. Corinna's cavalry were crack shots, disciplined and drilled to perfection. The path to the north outside the wall was beginning to open. Knights meeting the enemy supported by their ranged support. 3 weeks of siege from the Revenant army had taken its toll, but the supplies and the strategies employed by Hugwith, Corinna, and Alistan, the senior advisor and executive officer to the king, had kept the soldiers strong and rested as much as possible while breaking lines upon the gates in the most defensible positions. Corinna guided her left flank of archers toward a battalion of Revenant storming toward the king's guard and Avendir, the king's son. Arrows flew past the heads of the men, finding their way to their marks. 40 Revenant fell randomly dispersed in the large group. Corinna had learned long ago how to trust her fellow soldiers to do their jobs as well, and thinning a formation of soldiers front to back allowed the infantry to take enemy combatants on in superior numbers, instead of having gaps between evenly matched battles. The archers evenly thinned out the ranks, and the infantry fought 2 to 1 on the front lines, easily tearing through formations of the Dark Army. Avendir glanced back from his position in the midst of his men and found Corinna's eyes. He motioned to pause and support to allow them to resupply while the knights finished off the overmatched battalion. Corinna turned to signal her forces when she was knocked from her feet by a shockwave of air that likewise took down half of all the soldiers at the gate. She quickly scrambled to her feet, ferociously surveying the landscape for the source, and then she saw him, emerging from a cloud of dust stirred up by his forceful landing in the midst of the fray. Asari, the descended god of men. Avendir stepped through the huddle of soldiers to the forefront, facing Asari. You dare show your face to men, to your entrusted, as a foe? Avendir said as he scowled at Asari. Fall on your knees in reverence. Asari spoke with a power that seemed to rumble in their chests. Corinna made her way through her forces to get closer to the epicenter. She would not let their plan fail, or her people perish so close to safety. Avendir shouted back, You will find no reverence here, worm. By your own deeds you have been brought low, falling from grace for greed and power, seduced by the ravaging lord and made a fool to those who looked to you for guidance. The revenant forces in the army of men stood still in their places, waiting on their champions to signal the next move. Asari cocked his head, his expression masked by his black helmet. Men would not see his face. Men were not worthy to look upon his majesty. His sturdy frame began pacing in the clearing, no bigger than a tall man, but somehow intimidating regardless. His movements were without fear, but taunting in their leisurely appearance. He strolled back and forth, measuring up this mere mortal, Avendir, son of Amensol. This fight was beneath him, he thought, and his actions showed it. You may not revere me, Asari said, and you may not honor me, boy, but I swear upon myself, you will fear me. Asari drew his sword, nearly 3/4 the length of a man, and held it upside down. He thrust it downward, throwing it into the ground so forcefully that it sank in within a hand width of the handle. Asari clapped his gloved hands together and began uttering an incantation as the ground began to rumble beneath the feet of Avendir. Avendir looked around for a possible route of escape when suddenly the ground under his feet exploded violently, throwing him over the crowd of soldiers behind him and against the wall of the castle. Corinna had reached the gate and was running to ensure his well-being when she was stopped by a group of emissaries racing toward Asari's location. Enough! King Amensol thundered, godfall in hand. He emerged from the center of his party and stepped into the cleared circle where the fate of men would be decided. He walked toward Asari as an equal, fully committed to his belief that the war was all but won. We've come to the end of your days, Asari, man of Terminus, Amensol mocked. He held out his sword toward Asari and smirked. The soldiers behind him let loose a battle cry at his brandish, feeling the courage and confidence of their leader. Corinna hurried to the battleground, fearing the demise of the king and his arrogance. Asari was no longer immortal, but he was no man. His power and magic were not to be tested. She had to squelch this fight somehow. She found her second and whispered to him to begin rotating the troops out of the gates and up the eastern wall toward the north. They would need to retreat in haste if something were to end badly, and a feeling in her heart told her it would. She continued her trek through the mass of living and dead toward her king. As soon as I best you, continued the king, I will fell your entire army and bathe my homeland in their blood. The Dark Army will not last past this day. Amensol began shifting positions, leaving his sword out and pointing toward Asari as he moved about. I have heard of the end of this tale. Ganavi, goddess of the Gento and punisher of gods, has foretold your doom. It has been written that... As Amensol began quoting the prophecy, Asari's hand opened, and in the moment it takes a raindrop to fall from a blade of grass. Asari's sword shot from the ground and found its master's hand. Asari raced across the distance between them unnaturally quickly, and brought his sword up in full arc, catching the guard of the powerful sword of the elves in Amensol's hand. The sword was ripped from Amensol's possession and sent right up in the air. All soldiers stood in awe and fear as the sword lingered in the air for what seemed like forever. Just then, Corinna finally broke through to the fighting ground and ran towards her defenseless king. "Amensol, go!" she shouted. The commotion began, the two armies stirring, sensing a shift in the stillness of the moment. As she ran toward Amensol, the sword landed blade down in the ground in front of her, sinking in as if beckoning her to take it. Without slowing a step, she grabbed the hilt and yanked the sword from the ground while continuing her momentum toward Asari. Her arm followed its movement up, then down in an arc, spinning her body around as it continued up again. Her momentum carried the sword at incredible velocity by the time she reached Asari, seeming caught off guard by the sudden turn of events. His sword swung around just in time to redirect Godfall around to his side, but Corinna allowed the continued motion to carry the sword back around without losing speed. And this time Asari was just behind the move, as Godfall met his armor under his arm at his rib. The magical sword penetrated the armor just enough to slice through the flesh of Asari's side. The wound shocked Asari, who roared at this feeling of mortal pain shot through his once immortal body. He grabbed at his side. "Avendir, lead them north, go!" Corinna shouted again. Seeing their chance to get all to safety, Avendir raced to his father's side as he shouted orders to retreat to the Silent Sanctum. The spectacle was too great for many to even move, without some retreating immediately and some frozen to the ground. Asari looked down at his side and brought his hand to his face. Blood beaded down his fingers and dripped off onto the ground. Corinna readied herself for another melee, to give her army a chance to gain distance. The Revenant army looked for an order, a signal of what they should do as their high mortal leader stood wounded on the battlefield. Corinna was master of one-on-one combat, and the sword in her hand felt light as a ribbon, waving in her hand. She had to give them time. They just needed time. Avendir pushed and guided his father away from the battle as best he could. "Boy, what are you doing? This is our moment. We must fight!" Amensol yelled as Avendir beckoned him away. "Father, we have little time. Corinna has given us the time we need. We can regroup at the sanctum." Both Amensol and Avendir moved with their eyes fixed on Corinna's fate. Asari felt the dull, burning pain on his side. It was new, uncomfortable, but interesting. A rush of new feelings poured over him. It was exciting to him. Something about this new experience made him smile. Corinna waited for Asari's next move, and all of a sudden, he began laughing, staring at his hand in front of him. His laugh became louder and louder and began to ease the Revenant soldiers behind him, who slowly joined in the amusement without understanding why. "You are a foolish creature indeed," Asari said, still lightly chuckling. "You think you can beat a god? You should have left the fighting to the men and stayed with the children. My child is safe from your hand, you beast. Do you not know that? Oh yes, I forgot. You're no god." Corinna's concern turned to anger as she confronted the one who had brought so much pain to her life. Hanai, dead at the hand of the Revenant horde. Her parents, killed in a raid at her country home. She needed to protect her son, secured behind the ramparts of the Silent Sanctum, and ensure he would never see the ugly face of war. "Come on, men. Let me show you how I train children." Asari's smile faded in the face of this mortal woman's taunts. She would be an example of the fate of the rest of men. He raced at her again, faster than any mortal could move. Corinna's perfect form ensured her sword was ready for the first move. The sword muffled the blow, but it still drove her off her stance. She'd never felt power and speed like this before. Asari's move again, swinging faster and faster, circling her as she parried and tried to keep up with his footwork. His vanity opened up an opportunity as he lunged out of position toward her. She parried the blow to her side and brought her sword up to the other side, barely opening up his armor. The glancing hit gave Asari pause, and he backed away to calculate. At the sight, Corinna raised her eyebrows and dared him to keep trying with her eyes. She switched her stance to offensive and brought her sword up. She was ready for him. They just needed time. And then she saw stars. She felt herself falling to the ground as her vision blurred and went black. She didn't feel the impact of the ground. Avendir and Amensol were hurrying the soldiers away from the battle. When they saw Corinna suddenly fall to the ground, Avendir ran back toward her with a shout. Amensol followed behind. Amensol and Avendir stopped a few paces away from Corinna's lifeless body. A single arrow protruded from the side of her helmet, where it had found its way through a slit by the ear. Corinna was dead. Asari belted out a laugh once more. He turned to see a revenant soldier who had picked up a bow and arrow from the battlefield and shot it. It was a lucky shot that would have missed her completely 99 out of 100 times, and this was not lost on Asari. My. Life is so fickle, isn't it? Asari said. He stood in his place, feeling more confident now, being brought back to the fact he was facing mere mortals. "We finish this now, you and me," Amensol shouted, throwing off his burdening coat and shirt. His bare muscles bulged as he strained and flexed ferociously at Asari. "I am here if you want to kill me," Asari answered. "But don't forget who you are fighting." "Do you have any idea who you are fighting?" shot back the king. "Oh, indeed, Amensol, son of Avendun. See, you are already forgetting who I am," Asari said. "I've known you your whole life, abandoning your responsibilities, overcompensating by taking on everyone's responsibilities in your second chance in life. Though, I must say, raising your own bastard son as if he were adopted, that was truly a conniving trick. If only he knew growing up. Did he find out who you really are? Who we both know you are?" Amensol grimaced at Asari. His words just fueled his fire. Avendir stood back confused at Asari's words. Why wouldn't he know his own father? Asari must be trying to confuse us, he thought. But somewhere in the back of his mind, he thought his father had many secrets that he kept in the shadow. One day he would need to learn the truth from him. Amensol grabbed the sword from Corinna's hand and stared at Asari. "Arr!" yelled the king. "I am the keeper of your death, and I am the light that will cast out this darkness for the sake of my people. And I am the greatest warrior of the tribe of men, and I am no longer subject of Osari, of Vasta myth. I am a son of Terminus. I am a son of Terminus." The king raced toward Asari and faked an overhand strike and dropped to his knees as he slid past him. His sword swung low as he passed clear of Asari's blade and brought his sword up to the backside of Asari. The force, coupled with the sword's own power, brought a stinging blow to Asari's right shoulder, penetrating his armor once again. He stood and immediately attacked the backside of Asari, who was still getting used to the pain of injury. Asari slid to his side as Amensol swung down. Both leaders caught eyes, hunched over beside one another. Avendir was gaining confidence in his father's abilities to match up to Asari's mortal form, especially with a powerful elven blade. "For Havensong!" Avendir cried. Amensol smirked at Asari, staring into the darkness of his helmet. "Havensong will forever be a tribute to your death, mortal," the king whispered. Asari's mood changed in an instant. He would have the respect and fear he deserved. All men feared him. Nothing would stop him from restoring that fear. Asari's hand reached out and grabbed the blade of Godfall. He held it as tight as he could. Amensol pulled back on the blade, trying to free it from Asari's hand. Asari felt the blade cutting into his flesh, but he gripped it even tighter. He turned his body and faced the king as Amensol wrestled with the sword. As fast as one could see, Asari brought his sword up and shoved it through the left breast of the king. Amensol yelled in pain and still pulled on the blade, hoping to pry it loose. "Father, no!" cried Avendir, unsure of what to do. Asari put an increasing pressure on the blade as it slid deeper and deeper into the king's chest. It penetrated the skin on the backside of Amensol's body and kept going. The hilt finally rested on Amensol's breast. Asari moved closer, holding the king's dying body vertical, making sure he was the last thing Amensol ever saw. "I will make sure that Havensong, your precious Havensong, will never, ever be set foot in again," Asari whispered to the king. "I swear it upon myself." King Amensol looked up to Asari, gasping for air as his mind went fuzzy. Asari leaned back away from the king, still holding him upright with his blade. He brought his boot up and kicked Amensols so hard he flew off his sword and landed 2 spans of a man from where he was standing. Asari looked down at his defeated foe, overcome with rage at the nerve of Amensol to think him his equal. Asari turned toward Avendir, still standing silently, looking at his father and Corinna, his one and only love, laying in pools of their own blood. This was the end for men, he thought. Asari took a step toward Avendir and stopped. Avendir, son of Amensol, I have a task that requires my attention. I will meet you again soon. Watch carefully from your tower. Watch to the south. Have comfort in knowing that as slow as your death will be, it will eventually come. And years after, no one will remember your loss and your weakness or your precious haven song. Asari turned away from Avendir and motioned his army toward the walls of the city. Lorne, who had been managing the evacuation of soldiers, raced back to Avendir. Lorne had no time for mourning, but grabbed Avendir by his collar and forced him onto the back of the horse before speeding away to the safety of the mountains. The next day, Avendir sat in the window of the highest floor of the sanctum and watched as the Revenant army brought out the enslaved elven and giants they had captured a moon ago in battle. The giants were goaded to load pieces of the wall of Havensong onto carts and were hauled away to the south. A scout had reported back that, after all the army had left, Asari took the unburnt remnants of the south gate and threw them into the sea, south across the steppe. It was a long distance, but with the giants helping, they would eventually take every stone, board, and hinge and cast them into the depths of the sea. Havensong would be nothing more than a memory. Avendir had consoled now his people with the heroism of the final battle. His people were free to get to cover due to the love and fortitude of their great king Amensol. After the tragic death of his love, Corinna, the great king of men fought valiantly to his death, giving time for his people to make it to safety. They should find strength knowing that his will was never broken, even unto death, he told them. It was what they needed to hear. It was what he needed to hear. They would begin discussing strategy from here on soon enough. But today, the solemn day, as their home was carried off and dumped into the sea, he just wanted to be alone. It would be his turn now, and he had to get his mind right. He would lead his people. Corinna had told him once that they had one job, to anchor the throne fast for the sake of the people. They could not see their leaders waver or even show signs of weakness. He needed to be stalwart in the face of adversity. He would do it for her. He would do it for his father. The door to the room creaked open and a young boy about 10 years old stepped through. All the children had been kept away from the news of battle to protect the young ones from fear. But he knew that could not be the case for this one. Avendir? Cole spoke softly as he entered. He looked so much like his father, but he had his mother's gentle demeanor. Is she really gone? I heard people say she died at the battle. Avendir's eyes softened as his attention turned to the orphan child of his best friend at first love. Yes, I'm afraid so. Cole's head hung down, not wanting to cry in front of Avendir, the king's son. Avendir left the window and went to him and put his arms around the boy. Your mom, Cole, was so wonderful. She was courageous in battle. She was slain by Asari himself on the battlefield. I was there. Your king raced over to avenge her against the god Asari himself and challenged him. He saved the people by giving them time to get away. He loved your mother too, and he fought for her honor. And after an epic battle, Asari was victorious but wounded by my father. He was a great man, and we were lucky to have him as our king. And one day, when I'm king, I'll avenge your mother and my father and put an end to all these wars, I promise. Avendir continued to hold on to the boy as he looked over his shoulder at the ruins of his city. Anchor the throne fast. For Corinna, for the people, for his father.